Gilead is acquiring Arcellx for nearly $8 billion up front, a little more than 3 years after forging a partnership with the biotech around a cell therapy for multiple myeloma. We take a look at the deal on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. Plus, optimization and validation are needed to achieve ctDNA's highest priority application, surrogate endpoints for early cancer trials. And we'll have Steve Usdin's takeaways from last week's PhRMA forum. Steve also gives his point of view on FDA's Moderna U-turn. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues
Paul Bonanos, Director of PhRMA Intelligence.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of PhRMA Intelligence.
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
And Steve Usdin, Washington Editor.
Okay, we have the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit coming up in a matter of weeks in Seoul. We're hoping to see you there. We're going to introduce a new exclusive opportunity for our subscribers, the BioCentury Lounge. It will be a cool, dedicated space designed to connect, recharge, and inspire conversation among industry leaders. Also at the conference, if you're going, well, it's not too late. I realize it's a little bit of a ways from France or Washington, and folks in the Northeast are probably going to be snowed under for quite some time and unable to get to the airport. But if you're in Japan, elsewhere in Korea, China, hop on a plane and head over to Seoul to join us. We will have a special excursion on the heels of the conference to Daejeon. It's been called Korea's Silicon Valley. It's included in the price of admission for the conference, and you'll get to visit local biotechs and network with industry leaders in Daejeon. You can RSVP right now to our colleague Brian Denker at conferences@biocentury.com. It's going to be a great trip, and we hope to see you at the East-West Summit. All right, Gilead acquiring Arcellx, $7.8 billion. Paul, you've been looking into this. What have you found?
Sure. Well, as you said, Arcellx is already partnered with Gilead. So in a way, Gilead is sort of buying out the rest of the economics in its own deal. And most of that deal from 2022 has centered on a CAR T therapy called anito-cel. I'll spare you the longer name. There is a longer name, but we'll use that one today, anito-cel. And like a couple of other CAR Ts for multiple myeloma that are already approved, it has a familiar target, BCMA, the same as the ones from Johnson & Johnson and Bristol. Arcellx uses a different binding technology of its own, and the company believes that that confers advantages in safety. There's a lack of certain neurotoxicities, for example, Parkinson's, seen in relatively low rates for Carvykti, that's the J&J one, and also manufacturing. They say that they can produce shorter turnaround times. J&J has had some difficulty scaling up over the years to meet demand, and Arcellx believes they can do better. They already do have a manufacturing partner, which is Gilead, the company buying it. So anito-cel is already under FDA review in a fourth-line setting for multiple myeloma. Arcellx says they will have an abundant supply at launch and will be able to scale to meet full demand by 2027. There's also a phase 3 trial underway in earlier lines, as early as second line. Like I said, the deal gives Gilead full control, full economics. It would have owed milestones and royalties to Arcellx, and all that goes away now. Approval seems likely. The PDUFA date is just before Christmas. The data look good, 96% objective response rate. Overall survival is 83% at 2 years, and high rates of MRD negativity too. And for Gilead, it's a fit. Remember, Gilead owns Kite Pharma. That's the organization that's been working with Arcellx all along. And Kite sells 2 CAR Ts already for other lymphomas and leukemias, not multiple myeloma. We had a story even at the time of the partnership in 2022 about how Arcellx would benefit from Kite's commercial and operational and manufacturing strength. And now Arcellx is just going right into that unit. So the price is $115 a share for the takeout. That's above Arcellx's all-time high before today. And at 7.8 billion, the price would be, so it's the biggest among biotech M&A deals this year, but it's still early in the year. And for context, there were about 6 or 7 larger deals last year. There is a CVR associated with it. We've been seeing more of those lately. That could add a sum somewhere in the 300 million range to the total price. It's $5 a share. And that's contingent on anito-cel meeting a cumulative sales threshold of 6 billion by the end of the decade.
And a CVR, of course, contingent value right. We've been seeing more and more of. Lauren, do you have any take on the deal? I know you've been following the cell therapy space quite closely.
Yeah, I think that Paul summarized it really well. This is a competitor for Carvykti, which has been incredibly successful. I think it remains to be seen, though, whether there is that manufacturing advantage, because what we've seen J&J report with Carvykti is that the actual vein-to-vein time for patients is much longer than the manufacturing time that they've reported for this product. It's taken many years to ramp up to address the percentage of eligible patients that they are addressing now, which I think is a fraction of those that they could address. This is a second line approved therapy. And here we're talking about Arcellx potentially getting maybe a fourth line approval. So I think there's a lot that needs to play out. It will be interesting to see how this drug is used in the fourth line setting, given the fact that we have a second line BCMA CAR T approved. And yeah, whether they're able to ramp up at a similar speed to J&J or potentially better. I think it's early to tell. But efficacy-wise, looks very similar on the response rates. We don't have a ton of durability data yet, which will be important going forward because people are looking to CAR Ts as a long-term, potentially curative almost therapy, especially in multiple myeloma.
So, Lauren, at a higher level, it's been kind of a rough year for cell therapies. And, within CAR Ts, most of the excitement, of course, has been around in vivo CAR Ts. Obviously, this is a validated targeted technology in this indication. Sort of wondering if you think that this is indicative of anything broader in terms of enthusiasm, or do you think this is still just really a multiple myeloma play here?
I think when we're talking about in vivo CAR Ts as competition, especially in multiple myeloma, it's just very early. In that space, we're seeing individual patient results from IITs in China. We just don't have the data yet. And I think going up against a cell therapy that almost every patient you're giving it to responds to, and most patients, as Paul mentioned, above 80% at 2 years, still surviving. I think, again, we need to see more durability data, but efficacy, the bar is so high with these BCMA CAR Ts, the autologous CAR Ts in multiple myeloma. I think where we might see similar efficacy, but maybe a commercial advantage would be a rapid manufacturing CAR T. But I think when you're thinking about how this compares with the in vivo approaches, it's just there's still a lot of time for these autologous CAR Ts. And I think this is a reflection of that. There's plenty of markets still out there.
So is this deal really about that single asset, or is there an ongoing pipeline and future of CAR T that Gilead could be tapping into here?
I'm glad you asked. I mentioned that the partnership was originally struck in 2022. They actually modified and expanded the partnership in 2023, and Gilead has exercised an option on another BCMA targeting therapy, cell therapy from Arcellx, that uses an adaptable dosing technology and is kind of a next generation one, Aclx001. That also comes into Kite's purview at this point. And there is at least one other program Arcellx has described in its pipeline that goes to Gilead as well. It's also true that anito-cel has undergone some phase 1 testing outside of oncology in myasthenia gravis. I don't think Gilead had its rights outside of oncology under the original deal. So I think this gives an expanded set of indications to Gilead as well.
And Paul, it certainly looks like one of the biggest deals that Gilead has done in the past few years. They've had a few deals with upfronts around 200 million, 250 million, with total deal values approaching 2 billion. But certainly nothing this big since, I believe, the CymaBay acquisition in 2024, and that was 4.3 billion up front. So good play by Gilead, and I know they're actively building new buildings over there in Foster City. So we'll see what's next and how this deal plays out for them. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk ctDNA.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new co's. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
All right, we're back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. We're going to turn to circulating tumor DNA and its use as a surrogate endpoint in solid tumor studies. Lauren, there was a Friends of Cancer Research meeting on modernizing oncology endpoints earlier this month. You tuned in. What did you learn?
So, as you mentioned, we're talking about the need for standards and the need for prospective trials for circulating tumor DNA to become a measurement in surrogate endpoints. That's not new. We've been writing about this for several years. What's new, what I think is new from the discussion that I heard at that meeting and from speaking with people outside of the meeting, is the fact that it's now more refined. We now have a better sense of what actually needs to happen for ctDNA to become, the measurement for surrogate endpoints in solid tumor trials. We also have a bit of a roadmap for how to make that happen through this measurable residual disease negativity endpoint in multiple myeloma. We just saw FDA release draft guidance for that, which is sort of a similar early intermediate endpoint concept as ctDNA clearance or reduction in solid tumors. So ctDNA is the DNA that's shed by tumors, by cancer cells, when they die, either naturally or when you treat them. Generally, it seems to correlate with the tumor burden that a patient has. So the reason that there's a lot of excitement around this technology, measuring this as a surrogate endpoint, is because it would be, a very minimally invasive blood-based biomarker that could be more sensitive and could provide an earlier indication of whether a tumor is progressing or whether a tumor is responding to treatment than the traditional radiographic imaging that we have. So where it stands now, based on what we've heard at this meeting and elsewhere, is that there is evidence, retrospective clinical trial evidence, specifically from the CT Monitor program that is being sponsored by Friends of Cancer Research, that shows that there is a correlation between reducing ctDNA and improving survival and improved survival in clinical trials. But this is retrospective studies and it's advanced cancers. What needs to happen for this to be a really useful clinical surrogate endpoint is to do prospective studies where you don't have missing data, and to do this in earlier stage cancer settings where you actually need that earlier intermediate endpoint, because the trials are long, patients are living longer, there are lots of confounding variables. Like, a lot happens between when a patient stops taking this drug and when they would ultimately die if it's an early stage cancer setting. The challenge now is trying to make this validation in that early setting.
And what's the roadmap to doing that? Because it's not in the obvious economic interest of any single company to invest in that, right?
Okay, actually, Steve, I'm going to turn that question to you. What I was going to ask is sort of along those lines, where we've seen various things that FDA has promoted and wanted. An example would be adaptive trials and so on. And I don't know, maybe you and Lauren together can talk about this. Lauren, you talked about ctDNA being on the radar for such a long time. And I guess my question really is, does this sort of create a tipping point? Steve, in your experience with FDA, are there things that are sort of long-term issues that you get a certain amount of momentum and then something happens and you get this change? Or does this just sit on the pile of a long to-do list? Because what I heard from Lauren is what now has to happen is people have to run these trials, they have to do prospective trials. That sounds to me like a very long road still before ctDNA can actually get embedded. So well, I don't know, either of you take that.
Well, I think the first guy was, I spoke with Janet Woodcock about this and about similar things recently. And what she said is, it doesn't make sense for anybody to sit around waiting for FDA to do anything in this context or pretty much any context like this. They don't have the personnel now. They're not prioritizing this kind of activity at the moment. So if this is going to move forward, it's going to have to be by a kind of coalition of the willing. It's going to have to be something like Friends of Cancer Research, but on a much bigger scale than I think what they've done to date. FNIH, some other kind of
CPATH could do it, actually, critical path.
Yeah, maybe CPATH if they have. But this is a pretty big scale thing. I think this is bigger scale than anything that they've done also in the past. So all of those kinds of organizations, kind of public-private partnerships, I think could do it, but it's going to require really substantial funding, and it's going to require collaboration from the regulators, because nobody wants to get into something like this without having a good idea that at the end of it, it's going to have the potential to produce actionable data.
And so I think there are different steps practically that need to happen for this too. So one of the challenges is that we don't know when, there's no standardization for when you're collecting this data. ctDNA is going to exist at different levels at different points in the treatment cycle after you've used a drug. So someone has to figure out when we should be measuring this. Should everyone take a ctDNA measurement 4 weeks after you start a trial, or, whatever. There's also the issue of the type of assay that's used. So all of these things need to be sorted out by someone like Friends of Cancer Research, Critical Path, whoever can do it, before it makes sense for companies to implement these in clinical trials in a standard way where you could collect the data and try to ultimately validate the endpoint. But so this issue of assay type is another big
It's
challenge.
Such an old issue, though, Lauren. I really feel that there needs to be some kind of organizing principle or machinery for this, because you could go back to PD-1s, right? Where the issue back then is everybody's developing it using their own assay. And that just makes it impossible for physicians to compare across products. And here you're also talking about assay standardization.
Well, this is
the only
higher.
time I can think about this happening is during COVID, to be honest, when NIAID sort of forced the standardization of the COVID assays, because otherwise everyone was talking about different things. So how do you look at that?
I think this is even higher level than any of that. So there are two different types of assays, like classes of assays that you can use to measure ctDNA. One of them is this tumor-informed assay, where you take a tumor sample, sequence it, and then look for those specific sequences in the blood. So that can be very sensitive. And that's really important if you're trying to detect if a cancer is coming back, an early indicator of recurrence, which is what you want in that early disease setting. The problem is you need the tumor sample for that, which doesn't always exist. And as we heard at the meeting, FDA has been, to protect patients, limiting the amount of biopsies that are done in some cases. So then the other type is a tumor agnostic, where you're just using more of a general search for different cancer signatures, not as sensitive, and that's a problem. So I think what ultimately may need to happen is the tumor agnostic assays need to become more sensitive. Something needs to happen to make these better so that they could be used in all settings so you can standardize it. But that remains to be seen.
So what does your gut say? I mean, Lauren and Steve, what does your gut say in terms of, are we going to be talking about this 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line without much progress? Or do you really think there's an opportunity for somebody to come in here? Is there even a business case for somebody to come in here and sort it out?
Well, we're going to be talking about this 2 years down the road for sure. It's not going to get sorted out in the next 2 years. Whether there's going to be a lot of progress in that time frame, or whether things are just going to kind of muddle along, you would hope that there would be a lot of progress, but somebody or some entity or some buddies would have to step up and kind of take the bull by the horns and invest the money and the intellectual horsepower to make it happen. It won't happen on its own. And right now, there's no obvious champion who has both the capability and the financial resources to make it happen. I think there are several organizations, as we mentioned, that maybe would have the capability to do it, but they would also have to have the financial resources, and then they would have to have the convening ability, which would include regulators and NIH, and hopefully to do it on a global basis also, to include scientific bodies and medical communities and regulators in the rest of the world.
And I also wonder if the scale that this is approached with will matter. So we saw MRD negativity get through, and that was one indication, one treatment setting, and a very clear goal. You don't want to be able to find any residual disease. And that's not necessarily a blood-based test, but it's the same idea. But I mean, maybe we might see one very specific solid tumor setting where ctDNA could be validated by potentially a smaller group. This is a very big undertaking to say we're going to completely transform endpoints in oncology for solid tumors. You know, there are differences in different tumor types and different therapeutics and how they impact ctDNA. I hope to see some progress, at least in some indications.
I'm just going to go back and invoke COVID again, where, you know, in that situation, we just saw all of the farmers get together and say, how do we solve this thing together? There's definitely a case for that, but there's really no framework for them still to be doing that. And they could be solving issues like that collectively. They've all got enough stake in this and cancer therapies.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Lauren's story up on biocentury.com. Give it a read. Let us know what you think. And while you're at it, subscribe to BioCentury This Week podcast. All right. Steve, I've got to say, I didn't figure you for a Gunna fan, but your musical taste never ceases to impress me. Usually you're listening to some sort of obscure Japanese music or something that you've encountered in Georgia in your travels, but Gunna, I guess he likes taking the same stage as Stephen Ubel. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm speechless. I don't know what to say about that, and I do have to confess that I have never listened to Gunna and don't know what the music is about. But you know, this is a good way to introduce, my story from last week. It's about the PhRMA forum. I wanted to have a headline saying a funny thing happened to the forum, but I couldn't quite make it work. That was held at the Anthem, a big glitzy theater.
Yeah, I splashed cold water on that. I just didn't find much funny about what's happened in the past year. But the story did give me an opportunity to put in one of my favorite bands, the Flaming Lips. And I know that you're now interested upon learning that they often take the stage with 30-foot tall inflatable jiggling pink robots. But we're here to talk about a different sort of thing that was on
actually
stage.
And there was a kind of a 30-foot robot in the room during the meeting at the PhRMA forum last week. And the interesting thing is that he wasn't really discussed much. So last year, a year ago, they had a similar event in the same space, and the CEOs of pharma companies and the CEO of PhRMA were falling all over themselves, lavishing praise on President Trump. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, even said that he was going to make America great again, and that's what was going to be great for the pharmaceutical industry, and so on. This year, the CEOs didn't mention Trump at all. What was interesting was what they did talk about. So there were two things, really. One was China. There was a great deal of discussion about China. And the other was MFN. About China was interesting because Steve Ubel, the CEO of PhRMA, near the beginning, he came out and did his opening keynote talk. And he started talking about statistics about China. He said China conducts phase 1 trials 50% faster and 40% cheaper than the United States. The companies headquartered in China now conduct 30% of all clinical trials globally, up from 5% a decade ago, and that they're on track to surpass the United States the next few years. And he also talked about the fact that Chinese companies are not simply developing Me Too drugs, that they're innovating. There was a lot of discussion on the stage about what this means for the United States, what it means for the patients, and so on. What wasn't discussed, which was interesting, is the amount of money that multinational corporations, including Pfizer and Albert Bourla who was in on these discussions, how much money they're investing in China and how committed they are to expanding their China-based R&D and manufacturing footprints and integrating China into the global pharma ecosystem. There was one person there who did talk about that, Frank Ledoux, a former McKinsey leader, and and he basically said, look, when you're looking at it from the big picture, that it makes sense to think about China and say, are they going to be bringing new innovative drugs to patients around the world? And if they are, then they should be welcome to doing that. And he also said that it doesn't make so much sense to be as concerned as some of the people on the stage there seem to be about the Chinese biopharmaceutical industry, because he said that the reality is that Chinese companies are completely dependent on foreign markets, that they don't have a large enough domestic market to sustain innovation, and that there are very few Chinese companies that have the capability to be competitive on a global stage, that they're going to need to collaborate with companies from around the world, from the United States and from Europe and other parts of Asia to reach global markets.
Steve, I think that's really interesting. I think, Frank he really brings knowledge of somebody I think he's lived in Hong Kong for over 20 years. I mean, he really understands that ecosystem in a much more sophisticated way. It's easy by a century, and many of the people we know would agree that we should welcome China into the ecosystem. So that's not necessarily specifically new, but understanding the threat that China companies do and don't actually pose, and the fact that they need to access the global markets is really interesting. How do you, think about that? I want to go back to your conversation with Peter Kolchinsky, where Peter Kolchinsky was really talking about how China can become, in the context of most favored nation, MFN, he was talking about how MFN, if it ends up just meaning certain countries won't get access to medicines, China has an opportunity there to say, we'll bring you a fifth in class and we'll do deals with you. And so there is this whole tension around the development of the biotech ecosystem there, where there's a lot of innovation, first order innovation, and there's also just a lot of capability and, the threat that they do and don't pose. And how do you reconcile these various different things that you're hearing?
Well, what's difficult to reconcile, and what I kind of alluded to at the beginning, is the view that the rise of China's life sciences ecosystem, innovation ecosystem in particular, is something that is detrimental to the United States or to the rest of the world. And at the same time, the enthusiasm with which American and European and Japanese companies are investing in China and welcoming them to this global ecosystem. So, it's kind of hard to have it both ways. I think that one of the other things that was really interesting, one of the things that came out of this conversation, was the discussion about the steps that the United States needs to take, regardless of what's done in China, to improve the innovation ecosystem in the United States. Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, noted that the Chinese government has undertaken deliberate steps to reform its regulatory process to make clinical trials, for example, much more seamless. As a result, it's far easier and quicker to launch first-in-human trials in China than elsewhere, makes it possible for companies to iterate much more easily, and that's important for technologies like bispecific antibodies or CAR-T. And then the interesting thing he said, and we could do something similar here in the United States. And I think that was one of the more interesting things that was said all day long. Basically, the idea that the United States could learn from some of the things that have helped China advance so rapidly and adopt some of the things in the United States.
Steve, another story you wrote last week was on the U-turn by FDA leadership, the initial refusal to file of a vaccine application from Moderna. What can companies learn from what transpired there?
Yeah, so what transpired in short is that FDA gave Moderna a lightning fast type A meeting after they refused to file, and then came up with a path forward that will allow them to file splitting the application into a standard application and a accelerated approval application for different age groups. So when I looked at that and I said, well, look, there's two questions. One is what led to this reversal? And two, does it offer a replicable strategy for modifying or preempting adverse FDA decisions? The short answers are what led up to it is politics. And can it be replicated? Probably not. It's probably a one-off unique situation.
Is there a precedent for splitting application like that?
Not that I could find, and not that I knew. Not where you're saying, it's going to get a standard review for one age group and accelerated approval review for the other age group with exactly the same endpoints and exactly the same indication. I'm not aware of that ever happening before. It clearly looks like it was a face-saving move. We still don't know what's going to happen going forward. A couple of data points that are interesting. The MAHA movement has reacted with fury about the idea that FDA would review an mRNA-based vaccine. This is a flu vaccine. And some of the leaders of the MAHA movement have said on social media that if the FDA approves an mRNA vaccine, that they shouldn't expect MAHA voters to come out for them in the midterms. Another thing that I found a little bit interesting is that Vinay Prasad, the director of CBER, who was responsible for the refusal to file letter in the first place, seems to be taking a low profile now. There were events today around an announcement that FDA had for its plausible mechanism framework. Vinay Prasad is a kind of co-author of this framework and literally co-author of papers that have been published discussing it, and he was nowhere to be seen. I don't really know what that means, but it does seem that there's a lot of sensitivity in this administration around the vaccine issue. I know that there's polling that the White House has seen that shows that a majority of Americans favor vaccines. They want their children to have access to vaccines. And as a result of that, I think it's likely that we're going to see less, kind of straight up anti-vaccine activity and rhetoric from the administration in the run up to the election. But we don't know, getting back to the Moderna flu vaccine, what they're going to do in this case. There are a number of scenarios where they could try to slow walk it to avoid making a decision prior to the midterm elections. Problem with that is that they can't delay an action long past the beginning of August PDUFA date for this vaccine and still have it produced and shipped and available to Americans in time for the flu season this year.
All right. And we've discussed previously, and you've written about previously, just the importance of mRNA vaccines to get America ready for the next pandemic when it happens.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So I was at this plausible mechanism pathway event this morning, and somebody asked the FDA Commissioner McCary about mRNA vaccines, and McCary defended the administration's decision to deprioritize research on mRNA vaccines, to pull money away, even, a great deal of money that it had already committed to mRNA vaccine development for pandemic preparedness and other things. And even though it's not an FDA issue, so I'm not quite sure why he was talking about it, but he did. And he said, well, look, those companies made so much money from their COVID vaccines that they don't need government support for developing mRNA vaccines. It's an interesting argument.
Well, is it a common argument to come from an FDA commissioner?
No, it's not. It's not something you don't really expect to hear an FDA commissioner talking about BARDA or NIH funding. And two, I think that equating profits from vaccines that were developed for one kind of indication and saying that as a result of that the entire technology doesn't need investment from the federal government to develop it for other indications is kind of a leap.
All right. Well, you can see Steve's story about the Moderna issue up on biocentury.com. We didn't get to it today, but we'll have a story for you on the latest in obesity data from Stephen Hansen, who follows the space quite closely, looking at what Novo Nordisk's latest CagriSema data mean for the therapy's commercial prospects, as well as for Novo Nordisk's bid to slow down Eli Lilly's takeover of the obesity market. Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to our podcasts, and we will catch you next week. And a special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra, which produces the music for our podcasts. And what's next from them? Friday, March 13th, Mahler's 6th. That should be a good one. Symphony number 6. Tragic. We'll catch you next week.